Okinawa, 1995. Two men sit across from each other at a conference table in Tennessee. One is American, gray-haired, wearing a USS Callahan reunion cap. The other is Japanese, well-dressed in a business suit, his hands folded carefully on the table. Between them lies 50 years of history. The American extends his hand. The Japanese man takes it. And then something remarkable happens. Both men begin to cry. "You saved my life," the Japanese man says through an interpreter. The American shakes his head. "We shot you down." "Yes," the Japanese man replies. "And then you rescued me from the sea." This is the story of how that moment came to be. This is the story of Kaoru Hasegawa, the kamikaze pilot whose mission failed, and the American sailors who became his saviors. But to understand what happened on May 25, 1945, we need to go back. Back to when a young Japanese officer made a choice that would define the rest of his life. The year is 1943. Japan is losing the war. Anyone paying attention can see it. After Midway, after Guadalcanal, after a string of devastating defeats across the Pacific, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. American forces are island-hopping their way toward the Japanese homeland. American factories are producing ships and planes faster than Japan can sink them. American pilots are getting better while Japanese aces fall from the sky, one by one, their experience and skill dying with them. In Tokyo, in the corridors of power where maps cover every wall and pins mark the steady American advance, military planners face an impossible equation. They don't have enough planes, they don't have enough fuel, they don't have enough trained pilots. But they do have one thing in abundance: young men willing to die for their country. October 19th, 1944, Mabalacat Airfield, Philippines. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stands before a group of naval aviators. He's a hard man, his face weathered by years of command, his eyes holding the weight of decisions no one should have to make. He looks at these young pilots and tells them something that changes the war. Japan's salvation no longer depends on the ministers, he says, his voice steady and cold, nor on the general staff, and certainly not on the lowly fleet commanders like me. It rests now on spirited young men such as you. The pilots listen. They're the best of what remains, veterans who've survived the meat grinder of the Pacific War. They know what's coming before he says it. "I am asking you to become gods," Onishi continues, "to crash your planes into enemy carriers, to give your bodies as weapons, to embrace the spirit of the divine wind that once saved Japan from the Mongols." The term he uses is kamikaze, divine wind. In the room, there's silence. Then, one by one, the pilots volunteer. Some because they truly believe, some because refusing is unthinkable, some because they've watched so many comrades die already that one more death seems meaningless. This is how it begins. This is how the Kamikaze Corps is born. Kaoru Hasegawa is not present at that meeting. In 1944, he's a lieutenant junior grade in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a skilled pilot flying conventional missions. He has a hometown. He has a family. He has, until this point, a reasonable expectation of survival if he's careful and lucky. But by early 1945, careful and lucky aren't options anymore. The Americans take Iwo Jima in March. It cost them dearly 7,000 dead, 19,000 wounded, but they take it. Now American bombers can reach Tokyo with fighter escort. The B-29 superfortresses that were once just a distant threat are now overhead regularly, turning Japanese cities into firestorms. And then comes Okinawa. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, April Fool's Day. The Americans call their invasion Operation Iceberg. The Japanese call it the beginning of the end. Okinawa is only 340 miles from the Japanese mainland. Take Okinawa and the Americans have airfields close enough to launch a full invasion of Japan proper. Take Okinawa and the war is effectively over. Everyone knows it. Which means Okinawa must be held at any cost. The cost, as it turns out, is nearly everything Japan has left. The Imperial General Headquarters activates Operation Tengo. It's a desperate plan because it's all they have left. Every available aircraft in Kyushu and Formosa is readied for suicide attacks. Over 3,000 planes. Waves of kamikazes that will throw themselves against the American fleet in mass formations called kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. Beautiful name for something so terrible. Hasegawa receives his orders. He's assigned to Squadron 12, part of the Special Naval Attack Corps. He'll be flying a Yokosuka P-1Y Ginga bomber. The Americans call them Francis. It's actually a good plane. Fast, long range, equipped with radar. Hasegawa and his fellow pilots often joke about how wasteful it is to use such capable aircraft for suicide attacks when they could be so much more effective in conventional bombing roles. But there are no conventional roles anymore. There's only kikusui, only floating chrysanthemums. Hasegawa prepares for what he believes will be his final mission. There are rituals, ceremonies, a headband bearing the rising sun made by 1,000 women in Japan through a practice called seninbari, a 1,000-stitch belt meant to bring protection and courage. Letters written to family. Final photographs taken in full-dress uniform. He's assigned to lead a group of 12 bombers. Their target, the American invasion fleet off Okinawa. Their weapon, their planes, each loaded with a massive bomb. Their tactic, fly low over the water, avoid radar, find the biggest American ship they can, and crash into it at full speed. Success is measured by how many American sailors you can kill before you die. The orders are clear. The mission is simple. The outcome is certain. Except nothing in war is ever certain. Let's pause here and talk about what it meant to be a kamikaze pilot. The mythology says they all volunteered eagerly, that they were fanatics who welcomed death, that they flew to their doom singing patriotic songs, faces serene, spirits already at peace. The reality is more complex, human. Yes, some volunteered out of genuine belief. They'd been raised in a culture where death in service to the emperor was the highest honor, where the shame of defeat or capture was worse than death, where the concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, was drilled into them from childhood. But many others, they were conscripted, pressured, given a choice between volunteering for a suicide attack or bringing shame on their families. Pilots who refused found their families threatened, their honor questioned, their very existence made unbearable. And here's something that stayed classified for years. They were given full fuel tanks, not partial tanks as the myth goes, full tanks, because a bigger explosion means more American casualties, because even in organizing mass suicide, there's a brutal calculus of efficiency. The average age of a kamikaze pilot is 21. Think about that. 21 years old. These aren't distant fanatics. They're kids, college students, sons, brothers, young men who've barely started living and are being asked to end it all in the name of a war their nation is already losing. Before each mission, pilots write their final letters. These letters, preserved in Japanese archives, reveal the truth behind the mythology. "Please congratulate me," writes one pilot. "I have been given a splendid opportunity to die." But read between the lines, look at what's actually being said. "I have been given" is passive voice, not "I have chosen," not "I have earned." "I have been given," as if death is a gift he never asked for. Another writes, "I did not want to die. I wanted to live. But if I must die, let my death have meaning." The distinction matters between choosing to die and accepting that death is unavoidable, between genuine fanaticism and desperate resignation. Hasegawa later admits that he went into his final mission with conflicted emotions: pride in serving, fear of dying, guilt about leaving his family, and beneath it all, a question he's not supposed to ask. Is this necessary? Can my death really change anything? But he doesn't voice these doubts. No one does. In the Kamikaze barracks, there's no room for hesitation. You're surrounded by other pilots who've also volunteered, or been volunteered. To express doubt is to break the collective will, to weaken the group. So they go through the motions, the ceremonies, the farewells, the last cup of sake, the donning of the rising sun headband, and then they climb into their planes. May 24th, 1945, the day before. Hasegawa and his squadron are at the airfield on the Japanese mainland. Weather is bad: heavy rain, low clouds, poor visibility. These are not ideal conditions for a suicide attack, but the mission is too important to delay. The plan is for 12 bombers to take off in 3 separate groups. They'll fly low over the water to avoid American radar, approach from different directions, hit the American fleet at dawn when visibility is poor and the ships are most vulnerable. Hasegawa's plane is loaded with a 1,760-pound bomb. That's just under a ton of high explosive. The bomb is fused to detonate on impact. If everything goes according to plan, Hasegawa will spot an American aircraft carrier or battleship, put his plane into a steep dive, and strike the ship somewhere vital: the bridge, the flight deck, the ammunition storage. The explosion will be catastrophic. The plane, the bomb, the fuel, all of it turning into a single massive fireball that tears through steel and flesh. That's the plan. But Hasegawa's group encounters a problem almost immediately. The weather is worse than expected. The groups get separated. Navigation in 1945, especially flying low over open ocean in terrible visibility, is an art form involving dead reckoning, prayer, and luck. By the time May 25th dawns, most of Hasegawa's original squadron has either turned back or gotten lost. Only Hasegawa and one other pilot make it anywhere near the American fleet. They're flying so low that waves sometimes splash against their undercarriage. This keeps them under American radar, but it's exhausting. Every muscle tensed, eyes straining through the rain. The constant fear of hitting a wave and cartwheeling to a watery death before even reaching the target. Then, through the murk, they see it: ships. The American fleet off Okinawa is massive, over 1,400 vessels, everything from aircraft carriers and battleships down to tiny patrol craft, the largest amphibious invasion force in the Pacific War. For a kamikaze pilot, it's a target-rich environment. Hasegawa spots a large ship, the USS West Virginia, a battleship. She's a monster, 624 feet long, 35,000 tons, armed to the teeth, and she's right there. This is it. This is the moment. Everything Hasegawa has trained for, everything he's been told his death will accomplish. The honor, the glory, the chance to strike a meaningful blow against the enemy. He angles toward the West Virginia, lines up his approach. His co-pilot and radio operator are silent in the back of the plane. Everyone knows what comes next. And then, at 10:02 a.m., the West Virginia's gunners spot him. The entire world becomes tracers and explosions. If you've never experienced anti-aircraft fire, let me paint you a picture. Modern naval anti-aircraft defenses in 1945 are layered. You've got long-range 5-inch guns that can reach out miles and try to bracket incoming aircraft with explosive shells. You've got 40mm Bofors guns that fire so fast they sound like a continuous buzzsaw, filling the air with steel, and you've got 20mm Oerlikon cannons that are basically rapid-fire shotguns mounted on swivels, last-ditch weapons when the enemy gets close. All of this is coordinated by radar-directed fire control. The instant the West Virginia's radar picks up Hasegawa's plane, every gun that can bear on target starts firing. Hasegawa's plane is immediately hit. The controls go sluggish. There's smoke in the cockpit, warning lights everywhere. He's still flying, still has enough control to attempt his attack, but now there's another ship in the picture. The USS Callahan, DD 792, a Fletcher-class destroyer. The Callahan is newer, faster, and closer than the West Virginia. Her guns swing around to bear on the smoking bomber that's still somehow airborne, still somehow coming at them. The destroyer's name is significant. She's named for Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, who died in a night battle off Guadalcanal in November 1942, killed on the bridge of the USS San Francisco when a Japanese shell hit the ship's superstructure. The Callahan carries her namesake's aggressive spirit. Her gunners don't wait for director control. They see the incoming bomber and they just open fire. 18-year-old Leo Jarbo is a gunner's mate striker on the Callahan. He's been at general quarters for hours. They've been fighting off kamikaze attacks all morning. He's exhausted, scared, but trained. He sees Hasegawa's plane. He fires and fires and fires. The Callahan's 5-inch guns, her 40mm mounts, her 20mm cannons, everything converges on this one bomber that's trying to kill them. The volume of fire is so intense that the sky seems to turn solid with metal. In less than 30 seconds, Hasegawa's plane is riddled with holes. The engine is on fire. The controls are gone. The plane is falling. But here's what makes this moment remarkable. Here's the detail that changes everything. The bomb doesn't explode. A 1,660-pound bomb, fused to detonate on impact, somehow doesn't detonate when the plane crashes into the sea just yards from the Callahan. Whether it's a manufacturing defect, a fuse failure, or just dumb luck mechanical failure saves life. If that bomb had gone off, the explosion would have been close enough to cripple or possibly sink the Callahan. Everyone on board would have been killed or wounded. The ship's thin destroyer armor wouldn't have provided any protection against a blast that size. But it doesn't explode. The plane hits the water, hard. The impact is catastrophic. The bomber breaks apart. Fuel spreads across the surface. There's fire, smoke, debris. And in the middle of all that chaos, someone on the Callahan spots movement in the water. "Survivors!" someone shouts. The Callahan's captain, Commander Charles Hall, makes an immediate decision. They're in the middle of a battle. There are more kamikazes inbound. Every tactical consideration says they should ignore the enemy survivors and focus on defending themselves. But Hall doesn't hesitate. "Launch the boat," he orders. "Bring them in." The captain's decision isn't made lightly. In the heat of battle, rescuing enemy combatants who just tried to kill you seems insane. You're already at general quarters. You're already tracking multiple bogies on radar. Taking time to send a boat away leaves your ship more vulnerable. If another kamikaze hits while your damage control parties are distracted with prisoner recovery, people die. But there's something in the Navy code about rescuing people at sea. Doesn't matter whose people. When someone's in the water, you pull them out. It's one of those unwritten rules that transcends nationality or warfare. The Callahan lowers a boat. Sailors row through debris and burning fuel to reach two men clinging to a piece of broken wing. One of them is Kaoru Hasegawa. The other is his radio operator. Both men are severely injured. Hasegawa has contusions covering the entire left side of his body from hip to ear. Multiple broken bones, fractured leg. Several of his teeth are knocked out. He's bleeding, barely conscious, in shock. The third crew member, the co-pilot, is dead. He died in the crash or immediately after. The American sailors pull the two Japanese aviators into the boat. They're not gentle about it, they can't be. Time is critical, but they're also not cruel. These are enemy combatants who just tried to kill them, but they're also drowning men who need help. Back on the Callahan. A space is cleared on the deck. The ship's doctor is summoned. The two Japanese prisoners are brought aboard and given immediate medical treatment. Hasegawa drifts in and out of consciousness. When he's aware, all he can think is, "I failed. I was supposed to die. I was supposed to take an American ship with me. Instead, I'm being rescued by them." The shame is overwhelming. In Japanese military culture in 1945, there is no greater dishonor than capture. The standing order for all Japanese military personnel is to die rather than be taken alive. Soldiers and sailors are expected to commit suicide before surrendering. Officers who allow themselves to be captured are considered the lowest form of traitor. Hasegawa believes his life is over, not physically, though his injuries are severe, but socially, spiritually, completely. His family will be shamed. His name will be dishonored. Everything he believed about duty and honor has led to this moment of ultimate failure. The radio operator dies a few hours later. Despite the Callahan's doctor's best efforts, his injuries are too severe. He's given morphine for the pain and dies as peacefully as the circumstances allow. Hasegawa survives. That evening, the Callahan transfers him to the USS New Mexico, a battleship with better medical facilities. Hasegawa is on a stretcher, his body wrapped in bandages, his mind consumed with guilt and shame, and that's when he tries to kill himself. The details of the suicide attempt are sparse. Hasegawa never speaks about it publicly in much detail. What we know comes from his later interviews. He's on the New Mexico. There's a guard assigned to watch him, a young American sailor who probably doesn't speak Japanese and who definitely doesn't understand the depth of cultural shame Hasegawa is experiencing. At some point, when the guard is momentarily distracted, or perhaps just not paying close enough attention, Hasegawa attempts to take his own life. The attempt fails. Hasegawa doesn't specify how he tried, whether he had access to something sharp, whether he tried to strangle himself, whether he attempted to throw himself overboard. The method doesn't matter as much as the motive. He genuinely believed death was preferable to living as a failed kamikaze. The guard finds him, raises the alarm. Medical personnel arrive. Hasegawa is resuscitated, though he loses consciousness during the process. The young American guard gets in trouble for his inattention. He's reprimanded by his superiors. Hasegawa later expresses regret about this. The sailor was just doing his job, and Hasegawa's actions got him punished. But at that moment, lying in a hospital bed on an American battleship, Hasegawa wishes the suicide attempt had succeeded. "I was badly injured and did not see any reason to live," he later says in an interview. "At that time, I thought it was dishonorable not to have succeeded in attacking the U.S. ships." Notice the past tense, "at that time," implying that his thinking would change, that survival, initially seen as shameful, would eventually become something else. But in May 1945, as the war continues to rage around him, as the Battle of Okinawa tears both sides apart with savage intensity, Hasegawa is transferred to a prisoner of war camp on Guam, and he assumes his story is over. Let's talk about what's happening to the USS Callahan while Hasegawa is recovering in captivity. The destroyer continues her patrol off Okinawa. She survives the rest of May. She survives June. By July 29th, the island battle is essentially over. Organized Japanese resistance has ended. The Callahan has orders to return to the United States for rest and refit. July 29th, 1945. One more day and they're heading home. The men on board are exhausted. Months of continuous combat operations, constant kamikaze attacks, the grinding stress of being at general quarters for hours every day. They've watched sister ships get hit. They've pulled survivors from the water. They've seen what happens when a kamikaze connects. They're looking forward to going home. And then, in the late afternoon, a Japanese pilot finds them. It's not a sophisticated attack. The kamikaze is flying an old aircraft, fabric and wood, something that seems almost archaic compared to the modern planes the Americans have been seeing. But it's loaded with explosives and piloted by someone who knows his target. The pilot makes his approach. The Callahan's guns open fire. They hit him, set him on fire, but he keeps coming. He crashes into the ship. The bomb explodes. The Callahan is mortally wounded. The explosion tears through her hull. Fires rage out of control. Water pours into breached compartments. The ship begins to list. 47 sailors and officers are killed. 73 are wounded. Among the survivors is Leo Jarbo, the young gunner who had helped shoot down Hasegawa's plane 2 months earlier. The ship can't be saved. The order to abandon ship is given. Sailors jump into the water. Nearby destroyers, including the USS Cassin Young, race to rescue survivors. The USS Callahan, DD-792, sinks off Okinawa. She's the last destroyer lost in the Battle of Okinawa. The 13th destroyer sunk in the campaign. One more vessel added to the staggering casualty list of the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific War. The bitter irony is not lost on anyone. The Callahan survived shooting down Hasegawa, survived weeks of continuous kamikaze attacks, only to be sunk a day before leaving the combat zone, killed by a pilot flying a plane that looked like it belonged in a museum. In the POW camp on Guam, Hasegawa eventually learns about the Callahan's sinking, the ship that shot him down, the sailors who rescued him, dead because another pilot succeeded where Hasegawa had failed. The guilt compounds. The survivor's burden grows heavier. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackles over radio broadcasts across Japan. It's the first time most Japanese citizens have ever heard their emperor speak. His announcement is carefully worded, indirect, couched in formal language that takes most listeners a moment to understand. Japan has surrendered. The war is over. For Hasegawa, sitting in a POW camp, the news is devastating and liberating in equal measure. Devastating because everything he was willing to die for the defense of Japan, the protection of the homeland, the honor of the empire, has been rendered meaningless. Japan has lost. All those kamikaze pilots who succeeded in their missions died for a losing cause. But it's also liberating because, for the first time since May 25th, survival doesn't feel like betrayal. The Americans begin processing their Japanese prisoners for eventual repatriation. Hasegawa undergoes medical treatment for his injuries. The contusions heal, the broken bones mend. He'll walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life, but he can walk. He can function. He returns to Japan, and then he faces the hardest part, living with what happened. The immediate post-war years are brutal for everyone in Japan. Cities are in ruins. The economy is shattered. Millions are homeless, hungry, traumatized. The infrastructure that kept society functioning is gone. American occupation forces oversee the rebuilding, but the work is slow and painful. For Hasegawa, there's an additional burden. He's a failed kamikaze, a survivor. In a culture that glorified self-sacrifice and condemned capture, he represents everything shameful about defeat. But something strange happens in post-war Japan. The kamikaze mythology that was so powerful during the war begins to change. As Japan rebuilds and the full horror of the war becomes clear, people start questioning the wisdom of throwing away young lives in suicide attacks. A handful of kamikaze survivors begin to speak out. Not immediately, the shame is too great, but gradually, as years pass and perspectives shift, they tell the truth about the pressure to volunteer, about the fear they felt, about the friends who died thinking they had no choice, about the waste of it all. Hasegawa doesn't speak publicly at first. He focuses on rebuilding his life. He gets a job in manufacturing, corrugated packaging, of all things an industry that's booming as Japan's economy starts to recover. He's good at it, smart, driven. The same discipline that made him a naval officer now makes him a successful businessman. He rises through the ranks. Eventually, he becomes president of the Rengo Company, Limited, one of the largest manufacturers of paper and cardboard containers in Japan. Over 4,000 employees, international operations, real success. But he never forgets May 25th, 1945. He never forgets the moment his plane hit the water, the American sailors pulling him from the sea, the faces of the men who shot him down and then saved his life. As the years pass and the memories don't fade, Hasegawa begins to wonder, what happened to those men? What happened to the Callahan? What happened to the sailors who showed him mercy when they had no reason to? 1995, 50 years after the end of the war. Hasegawa is 71 years old, wealthy, successful, respected, but there's still this hole in his memory, this blank space where crucial details should be. He knows he was shot down. He knows he was rescued, but he doesn't know the specific ship. He doesn't know the names of the men who pulled him from the water. Half a century has passed, and the most important day of his life is still partially obscured. So he hires researchers. He contacts American naval historians. He digs through Japanese and American war records, trying to piece together exactly what happened on May 25th, 1945. And slowly, the picture becomes clear. The ship that shot him down was the USS Callahan, DD 792, the same ship whose crew rescued him, the same ship that was sunk 2 months later, almost on the eve of leaving the combat zone. Hasegawa learns that there's a USS Callahan Survivors Association, veterans who served on the destroyer and lived through its sinking. They hold annual reunions. He contacts them through intermediaries. He explains who he is, what he's trying to do. He wants to thank them. He wants to honor the sailors who died when the Callahan went down. He wants to meet the men who showed him mercy. The response is mixed at first. Some survivors are skeptical. This is the enemy pilot who tried to kill them. Why should they meet with him? What could he possibly have to say that would matter? But others are curious, especially Leo Jarbo, the young gunner who's now a middle-aged man. He remembers shooting down Hasegawa's plane. He remembers helping rescue the survivors. He wonders what happened to that Japanese pilot. An invitation is extended. Hasegawa is invited to attend the 1995 USS Callahan Survivors Association reunion in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. He accepts. July 29th, 1995. Exactly 50 years after the Callahan's sinking, Hasegawa flies to the United States. It's not his first time in America. He's a businessman with international connections. But this trip is different. This isn't about business. This is personal. He arrives at the Reunion Hotel. He's wearing a business suit, perfectly pressed. He looks like what he is, a successful corporate executive. But his hands shake slightly as he enters the conference room where the Callahan survivors have gathered. About 100 veterans are there, gray-haired, some in wheelchairs, some wearing their old uniforms that no longer fit quite right, all of them carrying memories of that terrible day when their ship went down. Hasegawa stands at the entrance, and for a moment, nobody speaks. Then Leo Jarbo walks forward. He's the first to extend his hand. "Welcome," he says. Hasegawa takes his hand, and the dam breaks. Tears. From both men. From many men in the room. Hasegawa speaks through an interpreter. His English isn't fluent enough for something this emotionally complex. "The enemy yesterday can be your friend today," he says. "At certain times, man has to fight against each other, and nations against nations, and peoples against peoples. But when the war is over, they become friends." He explains why he's there. He's grateful to be alive. He honors the 47 men who died when the Callahan sank. He recognizes that the sailors who rescued him from the sea showed compassion in the middle of combat, a humanity that transcended the violence of war. Robert Thatch, who was a 20-year-old boilermaker on the Callahan in 1945, stands and speaks. "Well, the war ended 50 years ago," he says. "I think it is time to put all that stuff behind us. I believe in forgiveness." The veterans applaud. Throughout the reunion, Hasegawa and the Callahan survivors share stories. They compare memories of that day. The survivors describe the battle from their perspective, the frantic moments of combat. the decision to rescue the downed airmen, the medical treatment provided despite the ongoing attacks. Hasegawa describes his perspective, the terror of the attack, the shame of survival, the decades of carrying guilt about his failed mission. And something remarkable happens. These old enemies begin to understand each other. They recognize their shared humanity. The American sailors see that Hasegawa wasn't a fanatic monster, but a young officer following orders, scared and uncertain, who got lucky and survived. Hasegawa sees that the Americans who shot him down were themselves young men, terrified and exhausted, just trying to stay alive. Before the reunion ends, Hasegawa is made an honorary member of the USS Callahan Survivors Association. Let that sink in. The Kamikaze pilot who tried to sink their ship becomes an honorary member of their association. It's one of the most profound acts of forgiveness in military history. But the story doesn't end there. Over the following years, Hasegawa becomes a regular at Callahan reunions. He flies from Japan to the United States annually. He brings his wife. He gets to know the survivors personally. Friendships form. One year, a Callahan survivor presents Hasegawa with his wristwatch, the watch he was wearing on May 25, 1945, when they shot down his plane. It's a gesture of reconciliation, of shared history. The next year, Hasegawa gives the veteran a new Seiko watch, jeweled and expensive, a gift of gratitude and respect. Hasegawa does more. He makes a substantial donation to the Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. He attends wreath-laying ceremonies to honor the sailors who died on the Callahan. He uses his wealth and influence to create the U.S.-Japan Maritime Youth Exchange, a program that brings together students from both countries to promote understanding and friendship. In 2000, Hasegawa pays for 3 Callahan officers and their wives to visit Japan. All expenses paid. 10 days touring the country, meeting Japanese veterans, building bridges between former enemies. American and Japanese students who participate in the exchange program meet Hasegawa. They hear his story. They learn about the war from someone who lived it, who tried to kill Americans and was saved by them, who spent 50 years trying to reconcile the contradictions of that experience. "He was a very good man," says one American student after meeting Hasegawa. "I still keep in mind the story that he told us." Hasegawa passes away on January 9, 2004, at the age of 79. He dies not in shame, but in honor, remembered by both Japanese and American communities as a man who turned the worst moment of his life into a mission of peace. At his memorial service, Americans and Japanese gather together, veterans from both sides, students from the exchange program he created, business associates, family members. They remember a man who survived when he wasn't supposed to, who carried guilt for decades but transformed it into grace, who proved that enemies can become friends, that mercy can transcend violence, that one failed mission can lead to a lifetime of successful reconciliation. Now let's step back and ask the obvious question. What does this story actually mean? On one level, it's a story about luck. Hasegawa survived because his plane was shot down close to an American ship whose captain made a split-second decision to rescue enemy combatants. He survived because that massive bomb somehow didn't explode. He survived because the injuries that should have killed him didn't. But luck alone doesn't explain what happened afterward. The real story is about choices, about how individuals respond when circumstances give them options. Captain Charles Hall's choice to launch a rescue boat during combat, that wasn't required. That was compassion. The American sailors' choice to treat their Japanese prisoners with decency. They could have been brutal. War provided plenty of justification. They chose humanity instead. Hasegawa's choice to spend 50 years honoring the men who saved him rather than hiding from his past. He could have kept quiet, could have pretended it never happened. Instead, he sought out his former enemies and thanked them. The Callahan survivors' choice to welcome Hasegawa rather than reject him. They could have held on to anger. They'd earned that right. They chose forgiveness instead. Every one of these choices matters. Everyone makes the difference between this being a footnote in history and being a story worth telling 75 years later. Let's also talk about the broader context, because Hasegawa's story intersects with larger historical forces. The Battle of Okinawa was the deadliest single battle in the Pacific War. 82 days of continuous combat. The Americans suffered over 50,000 casualties, 12,000 killed or missing, nearly 40,000 wounded. The Japanese lost approximately 100,000 soldiers killed, and somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died, caught between two massive armies fighting over their homeland. The naval casualties were staggering. Approximately 4,900 American sailors killed, over 4,800 wounded. 36 ships sunk, 368 ships damaged. The kamikazes were a major factor in these losses. During the 10 major Kikusui operations, approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties were launched. The success rate was around 14%, meaning 1 in 7 kamikazes managed to hit a ship despite the layered defenses. Of ships hit by kamikazes, roughly 8.5% sank. These numbers represent real people, real deaths, real suffering on both sides. Hasegawa's survival is statistically improbable. Most kamikaze pilots died. Either they succeeded and crashed into their targets, or they were shot down and killed in the crash, or they were wounded and drowned before anyone could reach them. The fact that Hasegawa not only survived but was rescued by the very ship he was attacking is extraordinary. The fact that the bomb didn't explode is extraordinary. The fact that he lived through injuries that killed his fellow crew member is extraordinary. Stack enough improbabilities and you get a miracle. Or maybe you just get luck. Random chance playing out in ways that happen to preserve one life while taking so many others. But here's what's not random. What Hasegawa did with that survival. Survivor's guilt is real. It's documented across every war, every disaster, every situation where some people live and others die for no logical reason. The guilt can be crushing. Why did I survive when they didn't? What makes my life more valuable than theirs? How do I justify being alive? Many survivors never find good answers to these questions. They carry the guilt forever. It poisons their remaining years. Hasegawa found a different path. He decided that surviving meant he had a responsibility, not to forget, not to hide, but to remember and to make meaning from his survival. He used his business success to fund peace initiatives. He reached out to the men who shot him down, not seeking revenge, but seeking connection. He told his story to students, ensuring that future generations would understand the human cost of war. This is how you honor the dead, not by pretending they didn't die, not by glorifying the violence that killed them, but by working to make sure the cycles that led to their deaths don't repeat. Let's consider what the American sailors must have felt, pulling Hasegawa from the water. They'd just been attacked. This man in the water had been trying to kill them minutes earlier. If his bomb had exploded, many of them would be dead. They had every reason to leave him there, but they didn't. Part of this is training. Navy regulations are clear about rescuing people at sea. Part of this is tradition. Sailors have an ancient bond with anyone in the water, regardless of nationality. But part of it, maybe the most important part, is seeing the humanity in the enemy. Looking at a drowning man and recognizing that he's just a man, young, scared, injured, dying, and choosing to save him anyway. This is not weakness. This is not naivete. These sailors weren't peaceniks who opposed the war. They'd been fighting for months. They'd seen friends die. They'd watched ships burn. But in that moment, they chose compassion over vengeance. They chose to be the kind of men who rescued drowning enemies instead of letting them die. That choice defined them as much as any battle action. Now consider the Callahan survivors in 1995 meeting Hasegawa at their reunion. They'd lost friends when their ship sank. 47 shipmates who didn't make it out. Some of these veterans had pulled burned bodies from the water. Some had held dying friends who asked them to tell their families they loved them. They had every right to hate kamikazes, every right to see Hasegawa as a representative of the tactic that killed their shipmates, but they welcomed him instead. Why? Maybe because enough time had passed that anger had faded into understanding. Maybe because they recognized that Hasegawa, like them, was a young man following orders in a terrible war. Maybe because they saw in his journey of reconciliation something that honored their lost friends better than holding on to hate. Or maybe they were just tired of carrying anger, tired of the weight of war, ready to put it down and see what comes next. One survivor, when asked about meeting Hasegawa, said simply, "To come all the way from Japan to do this means a lot. That's it. That's the whole profound truth in one sentence. Hasegawa didn't have to make this journey. He could have stayed comfortable and wealthy in Japan. Instead, he flew across the world to meet the men who shot him down and say thank you. That means something. The mechanical failure that saved Hasegawa's life, the bomb that didn't explode, is worth examining. Bomb failures weren't uncommon. Manufacturing quality control in 1945, Japan was declining as the war effort consumed resources. Workers were exhausted, often malnourished, sometimes using inferior materials. Factories were being bombed. Supply chains were disrupted. A certain percentage of Japanese ordnance was defective. Sometimes bombs didn't explode. Sometimes torpedoes ran crooked. Sometimes aircraft engines failed at critical moments. American ordnance had similar issues, though to a lesser degree. War production at massive scale inevitably introduces errors. What this means is that Hasegawa's survival wasn't a unique miracle. It was a statistical inevitability. Somewhere, a bomb had to fail. Somewhere, a pilot had to survive because of equipment malfunction. It happened to be Hasegawa. The question is, what did he do with that accident? Because that's where the real meaning lies, not in the mechanical failure itself, but in how Hasegawa responded to being given a second chance he never expected. There's a philosophical concept in Japanese culture called ichi-go ichi-e. It means one time, one meeting. The idea that each encounter is unique and will never be repeated, so it should be treasured. Hasegawa's meeting with the Callahan survivors in 1995 was ichi-go ichi-e. Many of those veterans didn't live to see another reunion. By the time Hasegawa passed away in 2004, several of the men he'd befriended were already gone. That makes their reconciliation even more precious. They had one chance to forgive each other, one chance to transform enemies into friends, one chance to show that human connection can survive even the most terrible circumstances. They took that chance, and because they did, their story becomes more than just military history. It becomes a lesson about what's possible when people choose grace over grudges. If you're watching this and thinking, well, that's a nice story, but it doesn't apply to me, consider this. You probably aren't a kamikaze survivor. You probably haven't tried to blow up anyone. But you've probably been in situations where holding on to anger felt justified, where someone wronged you and you had every right to stay mad. The choice Hasegawa and the Callahan survivors made is the same choice you face in those moments. Do you hold on to the hurt? Do you nurse the grudge? Do you stay trapped in the past? Or do you do the harder thing? Do you reach out? Do you try to understand? Do you forgive? Not because the other person deserves it, maybe they don't, but because carrying hate is exhausting, because anger is a weight you have to bear every day, because sometimes the only way to be free is to let go. Hasegawa spent 50 years getting to that point. It took him decades to transform shame and guilt into something constructive. The Callahan survivors needed 50 years before they could meet their former enemy without rage. Maybe you need time too. That's okay. The work of forgiveness isn't quick, but it's possible. This story proves it's possible. Let's return to that opening scene. The conference room in Tennessee. Two old men shaking hands, crying. Everything that led to that moment, the war, the attack, the rescue, the survival, the guilt, the search, the reunion, all of it was necessary to make that handshake meaningful. Without the attack, there's no rescue. Without the rescue, there's no survival. Without the survival, there's no guilt. Without the guilt, there's no search for reconciliation. Without the reconciliation, there's no lesson for the rest of us. It all connects. One moment leading to another, building towards something larger than any individual participant could have planned. That's history. Not just big events and famous names, but individual humans making choices in impossible situations, those choices rippling forward through time until they become stories worth telling. So what's the final takeaway? Mechanical failure saved Hasegawa's life. That's the literal truth. A bomb that should have exploded didn't. And that malfunction meant he survived when he should have died. But mechanical failure alone didn't make his life meaningful. What made it meaningful was everything that came after. The choices, the work, the decades spent transforming survival guilt into purposeful action. You can be given a second chance by random luck, but you have to do something with it. That's on you. Hasegawa understood this. He spent the last half of his life trying to justify his survival by making the world slightly better, by promoting peace, by teaching history, by forgiving and seeking forgiveness. Did he succeed? Did his efforts actually change anything? Well, you're watching this video. You know his story now. You know that enemies can become friends. You know that mercy in the middle of violence is possible. You know that carrying guilt for 50 years can be transformed into grace if you're willing to do the work. So yeah, he succeeded. One final detail worth mentioning. In 2004, when Hasegawa passed away, his obituary appeared in both Japanese and American newspapers. Veterans from the USS Callahan Survivors Association sent flowers to his funeral. Students from the U.S.-Japan Maritime Youth Exchange Program wrote letters to his family. His death was mourned by people on both sides of a war that ended nearly 60 years earlier. Think about that. A kamikaze pilot, someone whose entire mission was to kill Americans, ended up being mourned by Americans, honored by them, remembered by them. That transformation took a lifetime, but it happened. And it happened because individuals on both sides made small choices that added up to something larger. Rescue a drowning enemy. Forgive someone who tried to kill you. Reach across decades of history and shake hands. Small choices, massive consequences. That's the real lesson of Kaoru Hasegawa's story. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. This story matters, not because it's unique, though the specific details are extraordinary, but because it represents something universal about human nature. We're capable of terrible violence. The Second World War proved that beyond doubt. Millions dead, cities destroyed, entire populations traumatized. But we're also capable of extraordinary compassion. Even in the middle of that violence, American sailors pulled a Japanese pilot from the sea. Even after decades of carrying pain, veterans welcomed their former enemy as a friend. Both of these things are true about humanity. We contain multitudes, capacity for cruelty and capacity for grace. Which one we choose to act on, that's up to us. Hasegawa chose grace. The Callahan survivors chose grace. And because they did, we have this story to learn from. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this one, more forgotten moments of history where ordinary people did extraordinary things, more lessons about what's possible when we choose connection over division. Next week, we're diving into another World War II story that you've probably never heard. It involves a German soldier, an American medic, and a decision made in the final days of the war that saved dozens of lives. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, mechanical failure saved one man's life, but human compassion saved his soul, and that makes all the difference.